I've been collecting and playing games for at least 20 years, and in that time, I've played a lot of games. I own a lot of games. I own a lot of games. I own a lot of games. When you play games on a wide variety of platforms, you get exposed to a lot of different kinds of games, and you begin to see relationships between genres and specific titles as they cross platforms. When playing games across platforms, the differences become important. These are what make a title stand out. That's what makes the experience really unique for the player. Now, when I talk about differences, I mean more than just the technical differences that might lead to some port being slightly different between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. These are certainly significant when doing a review at the time, or even making a choice as a customer, but in the grand scheme of things, when you look back on a title years after it came out, it really doesn't matter. The sort of differences I'm talking about are the differences that a title takes on by virtue of being an exclusive in the platform or something engineered to run on that game hardware. These features make a game special. These considerations and trade-offs that go into building a game for a single platform resonate and allow that game to transcend the immediate time in which it was created. It becomes a symbol of that platform and really embeds itself in the personality and history of that platform. It becomes timeless. Because of this, as a collector and a gamer, when you find one of these titles, it's a very special moment. It's a game that you know you're not going to find anywhere else. It becomes a shining jewel of your library. To me, this is what makes Star Fox Zero so special. It is one of these titles. Embedded in the game are all the qualities and virtues that the Wii U itself sought to expose the public to, its unique vision of what it could mean to play games in the living room. It's because of this that I think 5, 10, 20 years down the road, Star Fox Zero is going to be one of those games that gets looked upon fondly as not only another entry in the Star Fox series, but a title that really allows someone to show off the Wii U, and in a single title express what makes the Wii U so special. Star Fox Zero at its core is a space combat game. You take the role of a pilot of a space fighter, and you participate in dogfights and some planetary conflicts. As such, the mechanics around space dogfighting are really core and crucial to the game. And the way that Star Fox Zero uses the Wii U's gamepad screen makes dogfighting very intense. It also allows for a great variety of scenarios. You can have a mix of large-scale combats between frigates and swarms of fighters, and more intimate combat inside of a ship, or ducking around corners of some ductwork, or even weaving in and out of a base. This is all very seamless and makes the adventure seem that much bigger. You have different acts, different sets of scales to set everything apart. It's not just as a desert world or an ice world, it's am I fighting 100 people or 5 people? It accomplishes this by forcing the player to use the television screen primarily for third-person and more macro-level views of the fight. You're steering your ship and looking around side to side using the television. But when you need precise aiming with your weaponry, or when you need to go into a first-person perspective for more micro-level maneuvering, you look down on the gamepad screen. It becomes your view into what your vehicle is actually currently pointing at. The best comparison I can think of is the scene from Star Wars A New Hope, where Luke and Han are manning turrets in the Millennium Falcon, trying to fend off TIE fighters as they escape. Each of them has this very localized view of where their turret's pointing, being represented by 2 vertical grids, trying to fit their target in between. This is the feeling I got in every dogfight using the gamepad, and it made me feel like I was really in control and put my face very close to the fight. And when you're that close to the gamepad, the speakers themselves also become part of the experience. Radio chatter from Falco and Slippy come blaring through from either side as they're flying to your right or to your left, and because the audio is being manipulated to sound like it's coming from a radio, and the tinny nature of the small speakers on the gamepad, it sells you. Your brain thinks you're hearing your friends over this low-quality radio, yelling at you to get out of the way or to help them. You end up being sold on this suspension of disbelief. You're in the middle of this intense dogfight and your friends are there with you. And while navigating through the fray, you're able to tilt the gamepad itself in order to make very minute changes to your aim in order to hit small targets or to sweep across large sets of enemies. The best way I could describe the control scheme is it's multi-dimensional. You use the left stick in order to steer the ship itself, going left and right and pulling up and bringing the nose down. And the right stick's used for speed control. You push it forward to boost, pull it back for air brake. And while you're doing all this, you can tilt the gamepad left and right, up and down, in order to change your aiming reticle itself. So you end up operating not just with your thumbs, but with your wrists and arms as well. And it takes some getting used to, but once you've got it, you really feel like you're mastering the ship. You're piloting this sophisticated space vehicle. It made me feel like I was a much greater participant in the game. I wasn't just passively holding a controller and trying to play pretend. I was piloting an R-Wing.
Good luck.
Now, the scenarios which Star Fox Zero brings you into to use these controls are often evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary. Star Fox Zero is a very polished product, a very good representation of a Star Fox game. With a couple exceptions, the scenarios that it offers are very similar to what you'd find in previous titles. You've got your chasing the missiles before they hit the target, you've got to defend Corneria as the first level, and you even end up going to Venom for the final fight. And even the way you control vehicles in these different scenarios, having an on-rails R-Wing sequence, or having the Landmaster traversing ground, but again on rails, this all feels a little bit familiar. And that's not a bad thing, it's just the game isn't trying to reinvent Star Fox. This being said, there are a couple new vehicles that are introduced to give some variety to the scenarios. The first new vehicle is the Gyrocopter, which is primarily used for an all-range sort of traversal exploration type level. As opposed to always fighting, you're using the gyrocopter to navigate terrain, go under ledges and bridges, sneak past enemies, and there are some offensive capabilities, but it's an exploration game first. And this is really a first for Star Fox. Star Fox is usually a very combat-driven game. You're trying to hit targets and get high scores. The gyrocopter almost brings it in line with more conventional games, where it's about exploring a level. The second new vehicle type is actually an alternate mode for the R-Wing itself. It allows it to walk on two legs as a walker. This vehicle mode is used for some tight corridor navigation, and also specific situations during boss fights where you need to walk up to a terminal in order to invoke some action that's not necessarily combat. It ends up being very similar to some of the walker scenarios one would have played in the unreleased Star Fox 2 game for the Super Nintendo. The controls for this are a little kludgy. You use a single stick for all of your movement, so if strafing's not really a possibility, the best you can do is jump up and down and try to avoid fire, or just shoot the enemy first. It's definitely the weaker part of the game, and sadly it's a focus for the last boss fight, as well as a couple of select scenarios. The number of levels offered in the game is also surprisingly low. It seems like there are fewer levels in this than there are in Star Fox 64. Platinum Games tries to make up for this by providing a lot of high score mechanics. Finding golden rings, getting a certain number of hits on enemies, all to try to get you to replay levels, try them again, master the mechanics, master the vehicles, master the enemy waves as they come at you in each level. While this is unfortunate for those of us that don't really care about high scores, it does feel like a natural progression from the branching mechanics seen in Star Fox 64, which again rewarded players for replaying levels in order to optimize their playthrough, beat enemies potentially quicker in order to unlock different levels, and branch your way to Venom.
So, you must be James McCloud's son, eh?
As you're playing through these levels and different scenarios, there is an overarching narrative. It doesn't really provide a whole lot, it's really there just to set up the different conflicts and give you some context for what you're doing. Overall, it doesn't have any more depth than an episode of a Saturday morning cartoon, and that's okay. You're an anthropomorphic fox flying a spaceship. And much like a cartoon, action is the focus of the game. When you enter a combat, the scale of the fight is often very large, which is really refreshing coming off of the Super Nintendo version or the N64 version, where you're certainly in space and you're certainly shooting a large number of enemies, but you don't have an entire fleet laid out before you like you do in Star Fox Zero. A nice pattern that Platinum Games also followed with this was oftentimes anchoring a combat with a centerpiece, this large single vehicle or ship. It becomes the focal point. That's what you're pointing at the beginning, that's often what you're flying towards. And it allows a little bit of a juxtaposition between the size of the individual fighters, which are really small, and just this overall goal or this overall objective. It makes space feel big, which it should. It makes the game therefore feel big and makes your actions feel very significant. You're part of this larger thing. And when this gets woven into the intense dogfighting mechanics I mentioned earlier, the fights become a little bit chaotic, like a real war's happening, which, for me, honestly, I never felt in a Star Fox game before. The lot of that wars felt more like Star Fox and his 3 buddies shoot a bunch of guys. In a lot of ways, it felt a little more like Robotech, which I'm all for. And as I said, oftentimes, there's a focal point to each of these battles, and that focal point is oftentimes directly related to a boss that you fight, and this acts as the capstone for each level. I would argue that the bosses offered in Star Fox Zero are the best bosses offered in a Star Fox game to date. Each one has its own set of quirky, puzzly mechanics you have to overcome, whether it's shooting a specific target, or opening some hatch and having to hack something, dodging a specific type of attack, finding a hole in a shield. These all make you think differently. You're not just unloading your weaponry as much as possible like you did in Star Fox 64 and the Super Nintendo version and Star Fox 2. You have to think about what you're doing and still use the skills that you've been learning up until this point, which is something I appreciate. Sometimes I'll play boss battles in games and they'll have some sort of a set piece where you have to use some new mechanic that was just introduced because the developers want a specific moment. Star Fox avoids that. They give you something fresh, but you're still using the same bombs, the same lasers, the same vehicles that you're familiar with. You're rewarded for understanding the game. And the paint on top of all this are very bright visuals. Ships look very mechanical and rigid, but the characters themselves still look very cartoony, not at all hyper-realistic, which makes perfect sense for this cartoony, action-packed world that you're flying around in. Objects and vehicles are very easy to see, and everything moves very smoothly. It's got a good, consistent frame rate, nice high polygon models. It's a joy to look at this. Overall, the core of the experience is the control scheme for the game, and it takes a little bit of time to get used to some of the nuances of it. Combining motion controls with joystick controls can be a bit goofy, and I had a couple issues with the walker myself. I thought the controls were a little clunky, but the pros for this game do outweigh the cons. This is definitely worth a purchase. The game itself is a little short, but the gameplay experience was so solid and so satisfying that it was worth it to me. Sadly, I don't think I'll have the time to come back and play these levels again or try to find all the different paths, but someday I look forward to going back and trying again. I'd also certainly say if you own a Wii U, you need to have Star Fox Zero in your collection. It's a solid title, and it's well worth it.